Awesome. Welcome everyone to Metagov seminar. We're so excited today to have Celina Su, but I'm going to pass it to Ian, who's a community member at Metagov, who was the one to introduce us to Celina's work, introduce our speaker. So Ian, off to you.
Sure. So, as many of you know, I'm a PhD student at the CUNY Graduate Center, and I came into Metagov a few years ago while doing some research on digital governance and blockchain. And in my time there, I've wanted to build more relationships with CUNY. Particularly, I think a lot of the great faculty and students who are doing, really meaningful and important engaged work that isn't always as visible in the digital governance spaces. Um, so Celina is a part of that. She takes or teaches a fantastic class on participatory democracy and social movements. And she just published this book, Budget Justice, that came out of 10 years of deep engagement with grassroots organizing. And I went to the public release talk at the Graduate Center and immediately thought, this is something that should be in dialogue with Metagov. And I thought Celina would also really enjoy getting to know the community. Um, as a formal introduction, Dr. Celina Su is the Marilyn J. Gittell Chair of Urban Studies and a professor of political science, environmental psychology, and urban education at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York. And I can pass it to you, Celina.
Thank you so much. It's really such a pleasure to be here. I'm excited to be in conversation with you all. Ian, I'm going to ask for a favor to interrupt me when it's like 17, 18, however many minutes, because I know I can go over and there's so many different aspects to this. And so I will try to keep it to 20 so that we can talk about whatever aspects are most meaningful to you all. So yeah, I'm excited to be here. Is it okay if I share the screen? Okay. Okay, so I will say that I first thought of writing this specific book in 2020. And I was really struck by the fact that suddenly budgets, which are typically portrayed as policy wonky and intimidating, became a popular rallying cry and on actual protest placards in the streets during the uprisings. So in the upper left, we have a screenshot. Uh, from the Vision of Black Lives, which was a policy platform for around 50 Black Lives Matter organizations. And they specifically talked about participatory governance in their plank on community control there. The lower left is just like a few images that just became a lot more common around then. And on the right, we see a billboard from an electoral campaign in 22 by someone named Kenneth Mejia calling attention to police funding, etc. And he won as Los Angeles City accountant, officially budget controller, against a much better resourced incumbent. So I was especially struck by the protesters' emphases on confronting economic inequalities in cities and about how it wasn't just about specific policies, but also about um, democratic governance. And it made me really think about budgets as specifically sites of contestations a bit more. When usually, especially since right now it's tax season, I haven't done my taxes yet. We're used to thinking about whether we're spending wisely and not buying avocado toast, etc. There's also the whole okay boomer memes to try to call attention to the fact that the social contract has changed. But just to say that in public discourse, we're used to personal budgets being talked about as something to be surveilled and paid attention to and sort of be moral judgments. And then somehow at the same time, we're told to just get used to city budget cuts every year and to pay more tuition, for instance, at local public universities even as there are like broken ceilings where I teach, one of the campuses I teach at Brooklyn College, and that this is inevitable, not a political choice. And this made me think about the notion of flipping the gaze. Usually institutions don't get the gaze, they gaze upon the individuals. And what if we were to flip the gaze? So I'll just quickly mention that the book is divided into 3 parts, each with alliteration. If I could have come up with a good alliterative title to the book, I would have, but they are Opacity Abets Austerity, Democracy is a Daily Practice, and Citizens Make Cities. So the first one talks about just how we have an utter lack of transparency on public budgets. Across the country, from large cities like New York to small towns like Asheville, we see people talk about how impossible it is to understand or analyze city budget priorities in a meaningful way. And it was during these uprisings that I really saw a lot more people talk about budgets not as neutral technical, but as moral documents that reflect specific values and theories on how governments should work. Um, as historian Kim Phillips Spine writes, all budgets tell stories about the future, a society's dreams, and its constraints. Um, and with this framing, budgets aren't prohibitively forbidding because they're inherently technical, but because they're designed to be anti-democratic. And in the US, it feels impossible to think about these questions of cities and budgets and who can afford to live where without also thinking about the legacy of redlining. So here I'm referring to the 1930s federal government policies of grading different neighborhoods for real estate investment, mortgage eligibility, etc. And neighborhoods that had any Black or immigrant residents were rated hazardous and outlined in red, guaranteeing a lack of investment and launching a century-long, thus far, vicious cycle of disinvestment. And, it was with technically neutral language, like, oh, not worth investment. That was sort of a self-fulfilling, that became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Um, and so here's Brooklyn. And um, and now we still see the effects of redlining. So I couldn't find the equivalent map for Brooklyn, but here's one from Richmond, Virginia, from a New York Times story. So here are the redlined areas from the 1930s, 90s, 5 years ago or so. And here are the exact hottest parts in town during the summer with the fewest trees and the most parking lots now. Um, and the ones that are getting the least investment, public or private now. And just to say that during heat waves, each degree of heat can increase the risk of death by 2.5%. And the hottest parts of town here are 20 degrees hotter on a summer day than the cooler parts of town. And so this is just one example. How else do we have these inequalities baked into our city budgets um, that and preventing certain folks from getting the resources and power they need to address their needs? And one first step might be opening up the budget to the public. And so I try to just like look at this New York City budget, which is a 530-page PDF. I did meet a community organizer from Birmingham, Alabama, who takes folks to who calls PDFs pretty damn fucked. And he and I've since found out that this is like the default. This is a commonplace across American cities. This looks like it's from a dot matrix printer. I can't even do a basic CSV file download to do even really basic number crunching. This is a random page from the police one. And we see in the top line that the housing police went down by, it's covered for part of my screen, but I think like $33,000. Okay, fine. But then what's up with the 1.7 billion new line in the second line of patrol? We can't compare this year's number to last year's number. I know that they had a patrol force last year. So where is this line coming from? So, and this is without even talking to city worker friends who are like, oh, by the way, police overtime, which was $800 million over budget, is not under the police budget, etc. So these are really basic things to ask for. Um, and this is really not just technical, but anti-democratic. And the situation has gotten much worse over the past few decades. Just as one example, during the 1975 budget crisis in New York, they took a small council of elected folks from New York City who were trying to set the city finances. They took away that council and replaced it with a new council of people appointed, not elected, at the state level, calling it the Emergency Financial Control Board. And a few years later, they quietly took away the word emergency. So it's still the council that is not democratic that helps to set our city financial policies. And this notion of preemption, which is when states preempt cities from enacting home rule or the ability to govern themselves, is growing. So basically, voting out politicians is not enough. This also made me think about what do we do with this information, even if we had transparency? Um, and and this made me also think about put what happens between elections and what other laboratories of democracy are out there. And just to make it explicit, I tried to put in um, I into a Guardian website interactive, like the likelihood that my vote would make a difference. And the percentage chance I got was 0. And I still voted for other reasons, but this just shows that there's something going on with our governance structures. And there's a reason that maybe people are not just apathetic, but actively disempowered. I'm going to skip over that one to say that to focus on participatory budgeting, and which is a process that started in Brazil in 1989 towards the end of their military dictatorship. And it's the most commonly implemented participatory governance innovation around the world. So that's one of the reasons that I came to study it. In New York, it arrived during Occupy Wall Street, not by coincidence. But I just want to emphasize here that in Brazil, where it started, it wasn't just a side queue exercise. Cities that had PB or participatory budgeting raised 30% more tax revenues than cities that didn't. They they helped to facilitate many more civil society organizations, and they changed concrete conditions on the ground through different budget allocations enough to reduce infant mortality. That's not the one that we got in New York, but I'll just say that usually it goes through this 4-stage process represented by the graphic you see. People come up with ideas. Certain super volunteers have to help to develop some of them. They vote, and the ones with the most votes get funded. I'll just give you some highlights from the New York process, and I'll just say that outreach really helped, and they really did engage folks beyond the usual suspects. So when we did like 51,000 surveys, 1 out of every 4 participants said that they were not eligible to vote in regular elections. And there's a lot of stories embedded in that we can talk about if they're of interest. Like at first, youth weren't allowed to vote, but they were still able to deliberate. And they so impressed the grown-ups in the room that with their deliberations, even though they were dismissed at first, like, oh, they're not ready, they're just going to ask for skate parks. That, but, and yeah, they asked for skate parks, but then within 5 minutes, not even a 40-minute lesson, they said, oh, They drew upon local knowledge. They said, oh, this block between 3rd and Lex feels unsafe in the after school hours, or it feels a little sketchy. And they came up with different ideas. So it was impressive that this showed that when people felt like they could make a difference, they participated. But also, very quickly, the process mutated. And here we see some graphics from the 3rd or 4th year, where in the lower right, you see city agencies like the Department of Transportation not showing up at assemblies asking folks, what is it that you really need? What is it that you really want? And instead saying, hey, we came up with a menu of options that really give you bang for your buck. And we also, by the way, did some hyper local research to tell you exactly which projects are based on our really fancy needs assessments and really were halfway done or even mostly done, but unfortunately suffered from some budget cuts last year. So if you could just kick in the last bit, you this would be amazing, and you would really have an amazing return on investment. So that it ended up shifting in tone from being about democracy to being a funding opportunity, sort of presenting folks again with a sort of menu of options, a sort of citizen consumer um, model. And this is from parks, et cetera. Over time, it this model of participatory budgeting really spread. And towards the end, it almost felt like, or in the past few years, to be honest, it's started to, there hasn't been a great variety of projects. It's a lot of like feasible, immediately feasible projects like laptops. And it's almost become a convoluted procurement process. So I would say that one of the biggest challenges is that of making sure that this is really about a new democratic model and not just a better bureaucracy. Um, so the last part, and Ian, how am I doing on time? Because I'm not seeing chat during slideshow.
We're at 15 minutes now, so you got 20
Woohoo!
more minutes of the
Okay.
20 minute.
Okay. And I hope I'm not talking ridiculously fast. But so the last part is about this challenge in really imagining a fully funded city. I skipped some quotes where basically the folks said things like, they make us think small. Like for instance, um, when I wanted different ideas about housing, they said, oh, no, you can't. That's too big. We don't think, we think small. What is this? It's not going anywhere. It's just people debating and speaking about minor things like traffic lights, garbage pails. It's not truly progressive. So, hmm, um, and it ended up being a lot of equipment. So, because that's the most feasible thing to get. So, um, so the last part of the book is about everyday citizens with a small c, regardless of the passports held, to break out of the confines of the popular imagination and austerity politics. Certainly, certain folks got really trained to navigate the city bureaucracy a lot better than they did 1 or 2 years prior. But they really complained about how their visions for a truly different way of governing and a truly different city got sidelined. And this notion of the citizen consumer um, was something that really stood out. And this makes me think of Heather McGhee's book, Some of Us, and she uses public pools as a symbol of how this citizen consumer mentality, treating public budget expenditures as private goods, because people aren't relating to each other in different ways just yet, both sows and feeds on racial and social divisions and gets fomented into resentments. So she quips, public goods are seen as worthy only so long as the public is seen as good. And she talks about public pools because there were quite a few American towns who in the 60s chose to drain their public pools where their kids spent all summer rather than racially integrate them. Um, so, oh, I think I skipped some slides. So one aspect of this that I end up trying to think about is how can processes like participatory budgeting help people to render themselves as a new public? Certainly to publicize is not the right word. We know how to privatize, but we don't know how to publicize or render public in new ways. Um, I'm going to skip over this slide. I'll just say that Oh, here. I'll just show these couple graphics to sort of capture a couple of the tensions in PB. On the left was a social media post that caught my eye. The person says, every year PB makes me die a little inside. In my district, we're pitting these functional school systems against the paved street, etc. This is a reminder that one of the richest cities in the world is nickel and diming itself out of a bunch of cheap infrastructure upgrades. So this is all um, especially fraught in a context of austerity. And the one on the right is just one example of an interesting project because so many of the funded projects ended up being about bathroom repairs. So that's set for elementary schools, so that 7-year-olds didn't have to hold in their PE all day. That it was interesting that that certain people started to sneak in different sorts of ideas, almost like Trojan horses. I call them sort of desire lines, those paths you make by walking rather than by pavement in cities. So here you have a project constructed by middle schoolers who use the same language of bathroom repairs so that they knew that it was likely to get approved, but it was really about creating all gender bathrooms. And
Sorry to interrupt. We're just about at the 20-minute mark.
okay, thank you so much. I'll just say that um, there there's a lot I would love to talk about. There's like different notions of rules and use. Coming from Ostrom of like how they were trying to get the city council members and the elected officials to not so much have new institutions, but use existing ones differently. And the one other theme that came up is how do we come up with truly different ideas? So some of them were coming from the this quote unquote solidarity economy. And here you have a map of different solidarity economy enterprises in New York and trying to sneak in these logics, these ideas from the solidarity economy into participatory budgeting. Maybe I feel like I can I can end here. This is a code, a discount code if anybody is interested in that, or I can just put it in chat later. Um, but uh, I think that a lot of folks were trying to think about how they could build upon PB and not focus so much on projects as budget priorities. Um, and I'll say that the the main impacts were not the projects themselves, but the so-called ripple or spillover effects. So the most interesting projects were ones that actually brought in a new idea, sort of like the bathrooms, or were sort of proofs of concept or pilot projects or down payments. Another example, for instance, was a couple $100,000 to make a subway station accessible, and they knew that it was a multi-million-dollar renovation, but they wrote in the ballot description, we know that this isn't enough, but if this wins, that means we have tons of popular support, and we want to quote unquote put pressure on you to kick in the rest. And that one succeeded. Um, so, um, and I'll also say that there's a lot of participatory budgeting around the country, at least a couple hundred processes, but they're often so small that at their worst, people get frustrated and it becomes demobilizing. And and they have the most impact when they somehow make people both informed and indignant so that they, given their limits, they know what to do next outside of PB. Okay, I'll shut up. Sorry. And now I'm excited to get to read people's comments on chat, etc. But yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you, Celina. Um, I want to pose a question that I think might help bridge some discussion with some of the Metagov community, because around the times of social movements, particularly like Occupy and beyond, there was also, these waves of flourishing of more like tech mediated uh, civic engagement and the civic tech communities. And there's sort of a spectrum of political agendas and ideologies within that. And I do feel like we're kind of seeing a new wave of that too, right? Where there's a real interest, I think, especially like post COVID, there's a wave of people developing tools and infrastructures. What I'm finding often coming from like very online or very tech focused communities, interested in understanding how local government works, trying to, I think restore a faith in institutions and democracy, um, and often fix longstanding entrenched urban social problems. And some of those tools and practices that are developed can be really compatible, I think, with the goals and values of more grassroots, like social movement or solidarity economy things. And some, from my perspective, seem to have a very different political agenda or like a different set of assumptions that are like baked into the very idea of rendering a city budget more legible or transparent, or having a public conversation about priorities. And so I'm curious how you see that, like kind of where the civic tech, public interest tech, like kind of deliberative tech landscape fits within the participatory budgeting and like grassroots social movement space. And then like what are maybe some points of tension?
Sure, there's so much to think about there. I'll say that within PB, of course, like they were choosing between different platforms like Decidim, etc., which um and they were definitely in that ecosystem, and um there there's so many different layers, but I'll say that for information, as I showed regarding PDFs, for instance, they could make digital platforms, could make such a huge difference in producing more accessible, legible, and it would be amazing if they were comparable basic budget data. I know a doctoral student who is in epidemiology at NYU who's trying to compare the city budgets of the 100 most populous cities in the US, and only half of them even have 2 lines per department under budget
Wow.
publicly available. So just like what I showed you, like police and then 1 line below. And so even just that, so it's so if we're not doing this for the internal bookkeepers, if we're doing this for everybody else, and I had to restrain myself when I was writing this book. I'm like, I study democracy, I don't study public finance. I'm gonna have to try to restrain myself from like feeling awful all the time that I'm not up on the peer-reviewed public finance literature. I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of like just an engaged, informed, everyday person. It shouldn't be so hard for me to have a very basic understanding. For those sorts of things, I feel like um, digital infrastructures can help a lot. But then there are other basics, like when we saw major basic digital divides amongst the PB participants in New York. Lower income folks were more likely to learn about what was going on through door knocking, through neighbors. The folks who learned about stuff through their elected officials or online were overwhelmingly of a very different demographic, higher income, more educated, etc. Whether that's because of data issues, we don't, like I know that like the Red Hook neighborhood in Brooklyn has focused on community mesh networks for a long time. So that's partly data issues. So even just really basic digital divide stuff exists. And then I don't know, and also about like data literacy,
Mm.
I would think also. But then there's a lot of stuff that just can't, we haven't figured out how to replace with like good deliberation that tends to be face to face yet. Face to face partly because at least in these sorts of deliberative assemblies, people are a lot less likely to troll or to say obnoxious things when they're face to face with someone. Like there were so many encounters, like this guy who is white presenting. I probably upper middle class or so, from the Upper West Side, which is an upper middle income neighborhood. Um, Walked across Central Park to the other side of Manhattan to East Harlem, and he said, "Oh, I was here to sort of on behalf of the PTA, like already pretty well organized parent group." Um, to ask for something for my kid's school. And you folks are primarily Black, Latina, Asian senior citizens in a local public housing project, and you don't have laundry
Mm.
and you're lacking physical mobility. I'm actually going to take back my kid's school proposal and help you develop yours. I saw dozens, if not hundreds, of interactions like that. And I know that this is fuzzy, but like I can't pinpoint exactly what, but I'm not sure it could have been reproduced through good arguments. They could have presented the exact same arguments, and I'm not sure it would have come to the same outcomes via digital spaces as these face-to-face conversations, because there's something to the chit chat before and after the deliberations, to being the physical space and seeing how depressing or not, or safe and cozy this senior this public housing building was. I can continue to think about it, but there's something about them figuring out together which sacrifices to make, ranking priorities, figuring out their non-negotiables, surfacing histories, and also like sort of like what the kids were doing when they drew upon local knowledge. Like sometimes they can put it down on paper, but sometimes they have to say that they have to think about like, oh, to think out loud together. Um, oh, this looks good on paper, but I can tell that it doesn't feel good in real life. And also different things are different for different people. Um, like um IEPs, individualized educational plans, um, you know, having more money for it is it can be really fraught. It can be weaponized in different ways. It can be, um, it's really a double-edged sword because it's something that people fight for, and it can get a student or a kid extra help. And a lot of families, especially from African American households, talk about how it's been weaponized to really discipline and punish and surveil kids and funnel children into special education in really punishing punitive ways rather than supporting ways. And that's not going to show up in the numbers that well. So it's, yeah, I feel like there's such a role that would be helpful. And also there are parts where I feel like real group deliberations I have not translated online yet.
Yeah, thank you for all
Yeah.
that. Yeah, my cousin is a psychologist who does a lot of assessments of youth for diagnoses. And, she was in the DOE, like the city DOE's register for a while, but even there, like the pay rent rate was really hard for her because she had so many student loans from her degree. And so inevitably there's also like the disparity of who even has access to the diagnostic technology and services prior, and then the know-how to like advocate once a diagnosis is there. Um, so there's a couple of good comments and questions, and I do also want to note the stack that Rick, Steve, Erica, and Anne all have questions. I want to make time for that. But I do think there's tension of like in person and online or different forms of mediation and connection and placemaking in a sense of community. Sounds like a really important part of the tension of this kind of work.
Yeah, what I heard was like, and I made a note in the chat of just like that the in real life kind of hot, like big strategic level budget discussions with citizens as participatory budgeting seems to work better or be more effective perhaps than like these online voting, multiple choice selection kind of tr small trade-offs, or at least like from some of the uh yeah, narrative like stories that you've told us, those have been some moments of like impactful, um, at least, yeah, that you've seen like impact happen at that level versus these like multiple choice experiments. Not to say that one is always better than the other, but yeah, that was something that I noticed. But yeah, I want to ask Rick if you want to come off mute and give voice to your question.
Yeah, I was triggered by your presentation because I heard Fareed Sarari talk on his weekly show about Zoran Madami's budget and his challenges. And I put all my questions in AI and and you can see the link there, so you can check it later to see whether this information is accurate or not about that critique, as well as some questions I asked about your own work. But you seem to be working at a sort of sort of micro meso level, but in one of the examples I read was that it actually had an influence at the macro level. So it's a circular process. So I don't know if you have any stories about how things actually went upstream to affect macro level changes. And the other question that came to mind was corruption. There's a lot of corruption. And how can this actually uncover corruption? I know people in politics who tell me horrendous stories about uh, corruption and budgets. So you can take that any way you like because you can't answer my question and give due diligence. But the AI response certainly gives a lot of depth to what I've just said.
Yeah, I'll have to check out the link you put in into chat. I'm excited to do that. I'll say that the New York version, that's one of the main critiques. It's so small that um, it it doesn't give much room to really ha produce outcomes at the macro level. And and what we learned from Brazil is was that it really changed the whole cycle from a vicious one of people not trusting government, therefore being less willing to pay taxes, therefore the government has trouble producing good services, giving funding good services without corruption, and it's stuck in a vicious cycle to a virtuous cycle of like, oh, people know where their money is going. They and they build enough power to pressure corporations or different sorts of development model to put pressure on different development models to be better. Like for instance, in Porto Alegre, a city of a few million where it started, once they had PB for a few years, they said no to certain luxury housing, luxury hotel type developments. They said, we actually, so that's the other part of it. If PB in the US is focused on helping people identify small programs and talk about technicalities, is it actually helping people to organize and build power to say, actually, we want this type of development rather than that type of development that actually has impact on a macro scale. I'll say that Massachusetts recently passed a millionaire's tax. I think it was like 2 or 3% on people who make over a million each year. And they made community colleges free, like im almost immediately. And yet it seems very difficult to imagine where it has not been tried. And Seattle also passed, not without problems, but a corporate payroll tax for local employers with a certain number of employees, so basically Amazon, etc. And right now, the New York City participatory budgeting process doesn't even begin to address these revenue questions. So um, ideally, it should start to force government to open up the books so that we see what's hidden, because right now the opacity does let interested groups get away with whatever they're doing
Exactly.
already.
Yeah. Well, just a quick follow-up on the housing issue, because Israel Klein's book identified that democratic cities actually do a much worse job in terms of dealing with high housing costs because they have higher regulations. I don't know whether that's true from your perspective in New York City or not, but housing, escalating cost of housing, and if you don't put a priority on low-cost housing, it creates problems. So,
There's a new book that's also really interesting called The Menace of Prosperity, that tries to grapple with this housing issue. And the one of the tensions it identifies is how difficult it is to say that to build housing when you have a certain notion of prosperity dependent upon um, attracting the developers and the rich. So there's a lot of issues bound in that, but I'll agree that this challenge of imagining, not just identifying priorities like housing, but imagining how we get what sort of development and prosperity we would like to be aiming for is one that has not been addressed by, I would argue, the Democrats or the Republicans.
Awesome.
Awesome. Thank you. Steve, you asked a question about the kind of current state or future of New York City
Yeah,
participatory.
basically two questions. The two questions are, so how do we get this minuscule amount of funding for participatory budgeting up? And how do we reduce opacity? What are the next steps in New York to get those two things done? And I'd also like to put just a little proposal out there. I have another proposal I have from the Mamdani administration for something called a colossal community center with rotating chef community restaurants, which could be a perfect onboarding like place for participatory budgeting to both people both to find out about it and to actually engage the process. So um, anyhow, very interesting. But go on. Please answer my questions if you remember them.
Okay, so opacity. Well, I'll say that apparently the Independent Budget Office has a book club, so I will be talking to them in a few weeks and collecting wish list suggestions for what they should be doing. It's hard because um, every city, the mini budget ecosystem slightly different, but in New York, um, It's the Independent Budget Office Controller and Office of Management and Budget. And it's the really the Office of Management and Budget that is so opaque. And then these outside sort of independent folks try the best they can to work with civil society groups, etc. But in talking to, um, but dealing with opacity, I think there is a lot of pressure to try to come to make them report different numbers. And here's where we need enforcement and empowerment more than different rules per se. Like there, a lot of the quote unquote best practices are already mandated, and a lot of the agencies, especially for better or worse, the police keep not reporting their numbers. At one point, the controller last year um, tried to make the absence conspicuous on his website by saying reported number of deaths in jails, legally mandated but currently not available, when he wasn't getting certain numbers from corrections and police. So part of it is just making them do what they're already
Oh,
supposed
so
to
this is
do.
a wide, it's not just budget numbers, it's all their numbers. They're just not reporting. Okay.
Yeah, because another part of budget numbers that would be helpful is knowing where the money goes and does it actually improve things. Like the does paperwork like for unemployment benefits say get processed a little bit more quickly? What are the waiting times? There's very basic performance metrics that are currently separate. So tiny grassroots groups are like doing the work themselves, putting them together to see what numbers they should be asking for. Um, and especially those sorts of numbers, we don't, there's agencies are supposed to report them so that we see how well they're doing, because we don't want to throw money and not get it at agencies if it doesn't improve conditions for everyday New Yorkers. And then the other question,
So you're
reg
saying we have to support these grassroots organizations that are doing this key sort of sunlighting work right now.
I would say, and the controller and independent budget office. There's a lot of there. And and I mean sometimes it gets ridiculous. Like regarding the police, for instance, in 2013, stop and frisk was deemed unconstitutional racial profiling. In 2014, and the police were supposed to report numbers. In 2014, City Council passed the Community Safety Act to enforce the court rules. In 2018, they passed the Right to Know Act to enforce the 2014 Act to enforce the 2013 court rules. Then in 2023, they passed the How Many Stops Act to do the same thing. And then they overrode the mayoral veto with a supermajority. It's like, why are we spending
Like
all
the
this
Trump
time?
administration and like Writ Small, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So when are we setting the stage for them to just weaponize what's already in place? Like, so, um, so that's what, so rather than like coming up with a new institution right now, I have to admit, I'm wondering how do we make better use of the institutions in place a little bit. And then regarding what's next for PB, I don't know either. I did serve on the transition team for I was appointed to the community organizing transition team for Mamdani, and I am in contact with the new director of co-governance, which is a new position in the new Office of Mass Engagement that the committee I was on tried to put to try to help to shape. It exists, whether it has political power, adequate funding, etc., is remains a question. But we are but I will say that your idea of colossal community centers is something that not in those exact words, the Office of Mass Engagement is thinking about. They're
Yeah,
thinking
I was
about
thinking on pitching it to them. I emailed it, but you know, it didn't go anywhere. So, But yeah, that's my plan. As soon as all this snow melts around here, I was gonna try and bike into the city and do some stuff. So
Well, because there are a lot of folks who are ready to be, um, there's a lot of things that are, a lot of folks who are ready to be activated. And certainly we can dream bigger, hopefully, than no kings and a lack of monarchy as our goal. But, and at the same time, the existing grassroots organizations say that they are overwhelmed, that the flood the zone strategy is working. So this new Office of Mass Engagement is trying to build new community hubs and new ways to increase the capacity of more informal groups who do seem like they're ready to do more.
Awesome. I think we have 1 minute left, but rapid fire. Erica, you have a quick question for Celina. You're next
Sure.
in stack.
Thanks, Val. Celina, thank you for the presentation. It was amazing. I just wanted to get your thoughts on how effective you think the New York City Civic Engagement Commission is. New Yorkers typically hear from the CEC when participatory budgeting is happening and they want people to vote on where to spend the dollars. But then you rarely hear about where that money, you hear about who got selected from their borough to get the money, but then that's it. Like there's no follow-up on how it was used or what impact it had on those organizations that received it. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on like efficacy regarding the CEC.
I would say that some of the same challenges that I talked about, namely lack of capacity um, and a preoccupation with institutional design rather than building new relationships that to of organized power and keeping people in touch, just like keeping in touch with folks and keeping them updated on implementation is part of uh, is part of what I have to say to them also. Like they're they a lot of the folks a lot of the agencies that implement these processes end up focusing most on the voting part because they're used to get out the vote electoral politics dynamics and they're not used to the other parts of teaching people about co-governance. And I hear this from folks in other cities also, like the People's Assemblies in Jackson, Mississippi, Nashville, etc. They're like, oh, we needed to have more political education. Political education, not as in like you should go for this policy idea, but like these are the skills you need to start to do something besides voting. Um,
Quick follow-up, would you say that community boards is a good stepping stone towards that?
I would say community boards vary greatly around the city, and and some of them are just about letting people vent, and some of them really try to work with folks to seriously consider different sorts of ideas. Um,
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. Let's unmute and give Celina a big round of applause as we always do. Thank you for joining us. 3, 2, 1.
Thank you so much. I wish I had more time with you folks, but I appreciate you spending time with me. Thank you so much.
Thank
Yeah, and
you.
for folks who didn't get your questions answered, I'll make sure that anything that was in chat, we follow up, Celina, and maybe we could either have you come to the Metagov Slack or I'll just email you the questions and then I can bring them over. But yeah, thank you everyone so much. Have a great rest of your day and see you next week.